So today we're going to be finishing up our talk about the Bauhaus. So what were the goals of the Bauhaus? First, the school wanted to abolish the separation between artists and craftsmen. They wanted to unify all art forms to create a total design environment, secondly. And third, they wanted to connect the school with local manufacturers. Often misunderstood as a single entity with a consistent program, the school was like a body of work. The Bauhaus was an educational program that occupied 3 different sites in post-World War I Germany. The first was in Weimar in 1919 to 1925. The second was in Dessau, a mining town, from 1925 to 1932. And the last was in Berlin from 1932 to 1933. So let's take a look at the Bauhaus, the final years. The Bauhaus was forced to close down in 1933 due to pressure from the Nazis. However, its ideas continued to spread all over the world, along with emigrating Bauhaus members to the United States, to Switzerland, to Russia, to Israel, and to many other countries. So the second from the last director of the Bauhaus was Hans Meyer. Hans Meyer was a communist and he widely supported a lot of communist activity on campus because he believed that the Communist Party was for the working man. He was born in Switzerland into a family of architects, and he was one of the most important functionalist architects of the early 20th century. In the Bauhaus School, he headed the Department of Architecture. In 1928, Meyer succeeded when Gropius decided to leave the Bauhaus as director. He held that position for 3 years. Even before Meyer took up his new post, he was encouraging widespread changes at the Bauhaus. He writes, "The future of the Bauhaus has become the subject of violent internal dispute. I agree with the students and the majority of the masters that we must take an absolute categorical stand against bogus advertising, theatricalness, and the previous ideas of the early Bauhaus." So what did he do? He expands the preliminary course. Students start to work an 8-hour day in the workshops. Architecture is then divided into 2 parts, practical and theoretical, and he revises the pay. In 1929 to 1930, we see the student enrollment rise from about 150 students to 200 students. And by the time Meyer realizes that this is a big mistake because he doesn't have the people to accommodate all these extra numbers, the workshops are at maximum capacity. When Gropius leaves, he's joined by 3 other masters, Marcel Breuer, Herbert Bayer, and Moholy-Nagy, all leaders of workshops. And then Marion Brandt also resigned from the metals workshop, and the appointment went to Alfred Arndt, who combined the metal joinery and mural painting into interior design. Meyer did not stop there after he had those changes. He planned further changes for 1930 and 31. He increased the teaching load because he didn't have enough teachers because people had left. But then he eliminated all the painters. And by eliminating all the painters, he felt like then we wouldn't be wasting time. We'd be doing everything that was much more architectural, much more utilitarian. He created the teaching environment and curriculum was based primarily on materials. So really understanding wood and metal and stone. He also replaced the pedagogical basis of the school into one that was not inclusive necessarily about all the different kinds of art, but what was based more on sociology and economics and psychology. And at this point, Paul Klee resigns, Heinrich Scherper resigns, and Jus Schmidt becomes the head of the printing workshop. And the weaving workshop stops doing wall coverings and tapestries and other kinds of weaving, and they basically just start to focus on floor covering and utilitarian things. So he did keep the theater, surprisingly, maybe because people were leaving so quickly that he felt like he had to keep some people. And so he raises Oscar Schlemmer's salary to bring it up almost to what Kandinsky had been making. And during this time, a new group forms in the school, and they call themselves the Young Group. And the Young Group brought back spoken word and emphasized work influenced by Soviet theater. In 1929, Meyer then eventually closes the theater because he feels like, it's a waste of money, and the Young Group is never heard from again. One of the important things that he does is he tries to kind of reinvent the Bauhaus building department and he partners them up with the trade union school of Bernau. Here's some of the advanced things that he does. He really is based on community. So he puts a gym in the school overlooking a park. They start to plan a lot more furniture. Here we can see like a walkway, almost like a greenhouse area that's all enclosed in glass, kind of going around. So he does like a lot of work on the living quarters to make them more functional, enjoyable. He greatly succeeds in motivating the students by looking at science and social criteria equally. He addresses the desperate poverty of the area. Remember, this is a mining town when we get to Dessau. And after the war, there just wasn't, much of anything. And so he addresses the poverty, and he does this by kind of systemizing the workshops to really push towards creating things that people will need to build. A communist cell had started at the Bauhaus as early as 1927. So remember, communism is catching on all over the world because it's an idealistic movement that is about the poor. And so people are interested in it because after the Industrial Revolution, we start to see a huge gap in wage. Wages are flat. Workers are being abused. We don't have the 8-hour day. We don't have lunch breaks. We have danger in the factory. Children are working. We have no child labor laws in some areas. So, at the end of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, we see a lot of people gravitating towards this idea of communism because they think that this is a way, if they band together, they're going to make a difference. They're going to be able to change, these poor conditions. So at this time in 1927, by 1930, they had grown to 36 students, and 20 of those students were fairly radical, and they were told, even by Meyer, that they could not continue their studies. And this is because he's getting pressure from the Third Reich. The Nazis are winning elections, and they're winning elections all over Germany. And so Weimar, they had already won. By Dessau, they start to win. And so Meyer, along with the students, had donated money to striking miners, and that did not sit well. And those miners happen to be communists. And so there starts to become this us versus them environment. And the mayor, Hesse, he calls for Meyer's dismissal and basically saying he's a Bolshevik, right? So we don't want him. So to make matters worse, 5 of Meyer's inner circle of students were expelled. And when they were expelled, the Nazis sent police in and they escorted them out of the building. And they were removed from campus within 24 hours. So Meyer is asked to leave. And when he leaves, it's a big deal. And they have to find someone else right away. So the person they install as director is this man, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. So van der Rohe was born in Germany, trained in a family of stonemasons. The architecture and design of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe starts to kind of take on a minimalist international style for the first half of the century. Mies went to Berlin to study architecture at the Vocational Arts College and started working in offices of Bruno Paul in 1905. By 1908, of course, this is where he meets Walter Gropius because he starts to work in Peter Behrens' office at AEG. He also meets other contemporaries there, including Corbusier. In 1930, the mayor of Dessau proposes that Mies take over the school. And so Mies becomes the 3rd director of the Bauhaus, where he succeeds Hans Meyer, who had been in charge since 1928. When he took over from the founder, Walter Gropius, Hans really wanted to make a lot of political changes, and as I said earlier, it just did not sit well with the politicals in charge, who were basically part of the National Socialist Party, which were Nazis. His assistants during this time period were Lily Reich and Hilbenmeyer. The outcome of the 1931 elections was a Nazi majority at the Dessau Municipal Council, who decided then they should close the Bauhaus entirely. Given the situation, Mies decides to move the school to Berlin, and he goes to a private area in his own name. He negotiates with the Nazi minister Rosenberg, and in 1933, he ends up having to close the center rather than to secede to the ideological pressure and lack of funds, which really pushed the whole thing over the edge. So a member of the November Group and an organization of expanding scope and impact on modernism, Van der Rohe, spends the first part of the 20th century designing buildings in this modern style. By 1927, the design and patent for his tubular steel cantilever chair bring him into the international spotlight, and it's also making him quite a bit of money. But the students, they were not happy. They were not in favor of Van der Rohe taking over the Bauhaus. Excuse me. So his tenure was in complete opposition by the students. And the first semester that he's in charge, there is a strike. Excuse me. The students felt that Mies van der Rohe was not a student advocate, and that his term would not include their voices. And maybe I won't have my voice in a minute. So the students start a paper, and it was in protest, and it was called the Bauhaus 3. And so Mies, with the help of Meyer-Hess, disbands the student government altogether. They disregard anything the students have to say. And he wanted all those students to supply him names with those who were involved in creating this newspaper, the Bauhaus 3. And of course, the Bauhaus 3 was very, very critical of Meyer's dismissal. So students at that point, if they were going to stay on at the school, they had to sign a contract, which was a new Bauhaus constitution, and it basically saying that they would not become communists, that they would not oppose, they would not put anything in writing. It was pretty much of a lockdown, and that was in October 21st of 1930. Gropius and Meyer had worked really hard to develop a broad, inclusive, social environment for the school. And the students loved that. And Mies, and in just 1 month of being in charge, had gotten rid of it all. And here we have a picture of Hans Meyer and some of the students leaving on a train after they were dismissed. The Bauhausers carried their fellow students who had been, expelled out of the school to the train in a procession. And this was a very dark, dark day for the Bauhaus. And there they are leaving on the train and, waving goodbye. Political activity of all kind was now forbidden at the Bauhaus. And you had to sign that contract, basically saying you would not be involved in anything that had to do with politics. Studies were then reduced to 6 semesters because they didn't have enough teachers. Every student was directed towards architecture because Mies thought that was the most important thing. The school was now only, for the most part, an architecture school with some very, very small workshops attached. By 1932, the Nazis seized power in Saxony-Anhalt, and the Bauhaus in Dessau was going to be established in Berlin, like we said, as an empty factory by Mies van der Rohe. And Hitler, the chancellor of the Reich, had an interview with Mies and cultural experts, and they decided in the autumn of 1933, they obtained authorization to continue, but considered the Bauhaus could not continue its atmosphere. So that decision was what forced the school to close. And this is a photograph collage that was created by a Bauhauser that was from Japan. His name was Iwao Yamawaki. and he was studying architecture as well as photography, and so you can see he really was influenced by the style of like collage photography that was Moholy-Nagy. And here, this is all happening when you can see there's Mies van der Rohe kind of down at the bottom, and then we have you know, other um, students, complaining. There we have the mayor walking with the Third Reich and the soldiers and people dying, and I mean it was pretty intense. And Yamawaki ends up becoming an art teacher and professor at the University of Tokyo. He goes back to Japan. So for 6 months, Mies had managed to keep the school open, but it was not an easy time. And the Nazis, just say they're going to take over. And despite an international outcry, the Gestapo enters the building in April of 1933, and by July it finally closed down because the students couldn't even come and go. Every student was beaten, or they had to check their papers, and it was this whole thing. So they finally said, that's it, no more Bauhaus, you are a communist threat, and we can't have you here. So in 1938, Mies leaves Germany, and he comes to the United States, specifically to Chicago, where he works at the Armour Institute of Technology, the architectural school, which he eventually came to direct. He designed and executed the campus for the new Illinois Institute of Technology and its prismatic steel-structured buildings and its beautiful brick and glass walls. And that's pretty much the end right there. So that's where I'll stop. That'll be the end of this show. And then we will go on and look at what happens to the Bauhauslers after the Bauhaus.